got the sense, now this is me just kind of throwing out my experience, that you weren't too excited about what you were singing. Did I read you right or read you wrong? Because you guys, when we had chances to clap, were like, I ain't clapping. Put my hands right here. Gonna keep them on the desk in front of me or chair in front of me. I ain't clapping. So I thought we'd try this one more time just as a church and so forth, because I heard some claps, but it was like, man, a room this size ought to have a little bit more volume to the sound of a clap if we're genuinely excited about what's going on there, right? So let's just try this together, okay? This is just me just practicing with you all for the game time when we get to heaven, all right? So when you see Jesus face to face and you're like, my goodness, you're amazing, what clap will we have for him, right? There you go. It's good to practice, team. It's good to practice, because when we get to the game time and see him, I'd be a bum for you if we're caught with our hands down at our side when it's time to celebrate what he's done for us. So anyways, good morning. That's a great way to start, right? And you're going, I don't like this guy already. He is very uncomfortable of a person. Well, it's going to get more uncomfortable this morning. If you're brand new, this is a great morning to be here with because we have a lot of uncomfortable stuff to talk about. But more than that, I just want to say I'm glad you are here. One of the things I wanted to kind of point your attention to, all of you that is this little handout you got on the way in. If you could open it up, I want to point out one quick thing, especially those who are new, but the rest of you can listen in on this as well. There is something called a Lunch with Tim that happens at the very end of every month. And this is for anybody, really. If you've been here a long time but don't really know me, this is an opportunity for us to get a chance to meet. And it happens the last Sunday of every month, and that'll be July 20th. And if you are new with us or think that you just don't really know what's going on, this would be a great lunch to be at. And you can check the box on that Connect card next to it that says Lunch with Tim, and then we will set you up with that morning or afternoon meal. So you can do that. There's a lot going on here. You can see with this page here, barbecue. There's a men's breakfast happening this weekend, so you can just read through these things. And there's a women's summer study. Just check those out and get connected. But we want you involved. We want you connected, and that's a great place to start. We are in a series, week 3 of a 4-part series that I think is crucial. Really, I mean, it's crucial for us. Because as I mentioned last week, there is a lot of bad press I think God is giving, which means that these conversations are really important, both for those who say, yes, I'm a Christ follower, and those who say, well, no, I'm really not. I just came for the free donuts after the service. And both of you, I think, is a really important conversation to have. It's a series called Better Than, and the reason we title it that is because everybody, no matter who you are, whether you are of one race or another race, or one kind of social class or another, you name the dynamic, is we all have opinions, we all have things in the world, whether it's small or global, we want to see changed. Every one of us, no matter how nice or how mean of a person you are, has thoughts on what you want to see change, because you have those thoughts because you think you have a better way. I mean, that's the underlying assumption. I got a better way, that's why this needs to be changed, right? I mean, there's no two ways around it. And let's just face it, not everybody agrees with your better way, and that's what the problem is. That's the problem with the world. They don't agree on the better way. And let's be honest again, another level is that we're not very nice and not very pretty when we disagree. In fact, we can be very, very ugly, right? I mean, I don't see heads nodding. This should be like, that's exactly true. Tim, you guys let's work on this body motion posture, right? Body motion is a part of spirit motion. When you agree, you nod yes. When you don't agree, you then no. Okay, I can take them both. So we have this aspect where we don't disagree well. And let's face it, every person in this room, you will have some points of agreement on what needs to change or needs to be, and some points of disagreement with everybody in here. There you go. Andy's got the hang of it. Head nodding for the entire service to let me know you still got it. Never stop the head nods. Okay, there you go. And we're just bad at that. And so what I want to do this morning is just talk through how we disagree. How do we disagree? This is a really important conversation that I think is driven out of the heartbeat of Jesus and really the text we're looking at this morning in Romans 13. So let me tell you a bit about what I think is the problem when we disagree. You and I, this is all of us, not just a them thing, it's an us thing. We all, when we tend to disagree with somebody, we tend to demonize people. The right demonizes the left, and the left demonizes the right, right? Christians of one tradition demonize Christians of another tradition, and they return the favor back on them. We create caricatures, little cartoons or snapshots or tweets out there that kind of summarize, and basically the goal of that is to show the idiotic position of the other side, and it's designed to generate some kind of feeling of hostility toward them, some kind of anger that they would be so petty or so foolish to hold such a viewpoint. I mean, that's really what, when you look at political caricatures right there, the goal is to elicit an emotional response of disgust that somebody could possibly hold that view. And we do that amongst each other as well. We do it across the aisle in our churches and across the ocean in terms of political views and across the ocean in faith. We just have this posture of argumentation. In fact, one social scientist author wrote that the culture we live in today, they defined as the argument culture. And I would have to agree, because we don't want to listen. We just want to draw conclusions for them, and them, it's like the people who don't agree with you, and they return the favor to us. In fact, when we do kind of cross the aisle to listen and say, let me just understand you and your history, where do you come up with those conclusions, those ideas, right? Let me understand that history that you've come from. We're seen as condoning. Well, how could you betray your own people over here and move to that side over there and actually condone what's going on there and actually agree with that? And it's not the issue. See, we just live in an argument culture, and sadly the church has taken part in that. Guys, this is something that as a pastor I see, as an individual Christian, I see and experience, and I'm not saying I see it in them, I see it in me. This is not look at the them and how this is a me. I'm a part of the church, and there's a lot that I need to repent of, and a lot that we need to repent of. Because we have stopped going after hearts, and we go after topics and social agendas, and we need to repent, because this is the point of the entire series we have, is that God actually has a better way. He has an opinion about that, and he actually has a better way, and it is not to change the them out there, it's to change the us. It's to change you. It's to change me. It's to change our hearts. Not so that but so that we can learn to love people who aren't in agreement with us. And the lines become very blurred sometimes at that, because, well, what does it mean to love them in this situation? What does that look like here? And those are some of the conversations we're going to have this morning. What does God, or how does God want us to engage a world that we feel and we experience like, well, there's so much unlike us? How far do we go? What does that look like? In Romans 13, Paul offers us a dichotomy, a contrast of two approaches, and we're going to look at that this morning. Romans 13 is where you want to be in your Bibles. If you don't have a Bible, I got you on the cover, on the screens. If you do, I would challenge you to open up. If you own a Bible, let me just challenge you to bring it, or whatever you use for your Bible. Just because I think there's some value in actually seeing it with your eyes, not just hearing it with your ears, so that when you come back to it later, you remember visual sight of what's been said. But in verses 8 through 10, now our whole series started in verse 1 and went down. Verses 8 through 10, though, Paul goes from, in verse 1 through 7, talking more about culture out here, to now talking about you. Talking about individual relationships in this conversations we have with people who disagree. This is not about in-house conversation, people agree with us. This is about conversations about people who don't agree with us. And Paul says, the writer says, owe no one anything except love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandment, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself, which is a quote from Leviticus chapter 19. And Jesus quotes that when he talks about the greatest commandments, right? To love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And Paul has taken that, obviously, from the words of Jesus, putting it here. This is the greatest. This is the summed up of all of those other commandments that are out there. So he says, love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. Now, if you've been watching up here, you've noticed I've kind of contrasted two words, right? Law and love. And then the whole statement's, there is one thing that you better not be in debt on. You should always make sure you're doing, and that is to be giving out love. Of all the things that we could say, what ought people who love Jesus be giving out? Paul, and I might say Jesus, but talks about love being the thing that you're constantly giving out. And he contrasts that with law. Because really, those are two different ideas about how to live this life or how to live a life pleasing to God. In the Gospels, in Jesus' life, the Gospels, we see this lived out in two kind of categories of people. There's Jesus and there's the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were, their name meant separated. And they were guys, they were people who deeply wanted the same agenda as Jesus. The Pharisees and Jesus had the exact same agenda. They both wanted to see the restoration of Israel. They wanted to see the nation of Israel repent, and they want to see them be holy. That's the agenda of both of them. Now, the Pharisees, their name means separate, so they live this out. The greatest commandment of God is to be holy. The greatest attribute of God is that he is holy, and so therefore to be holy means to separate yourselves from kind of the culture and live in a subculture parallel to that, and sort of then call people out of that one into this one, and never the two shall meet. And they really live by two kind of focuses. Negatively, it was to remove themselves from anything that was ungodly or worldly. Positively, it was to live by the strictest moral code. And their moral code was found obviously in the Bible, 613 commandments. It's the law, right? And they built extra ones around that because they never wanted to violate any of those. So they built kind of a hedge, they call it, around those commandments in which to make sure that they never infracted upon what God wanted them to infract upon. So that's one direction. And Jesus and them, again, let me say, wanted the same thing. Jesus was also convinced that God was holy. Jesus was also convinced that he wanted people to walk in holiness, but he went about it very differently in terms of calling people to that. Very different approach. In fact, there's a scene in, multiple Gospels have the same scene, but we're going to go to the Gospel of Mark, in which this contrast is presented, and I hope that we can utilize that, springboard from that, to get an idea both about Jesus and how he engaged people. So if you want to switch over now to Mark chapter 2, you can. Otherwise, I'll have it on the screen. But let's springboard into this conversation. Observations about Jesus and how he engaged people. How did he engage with people, clearly, who he disagreed with? And contrast that with how the Pharisees. Mark chapter 2, verse 13. You can give some backdrop to this. There really isn't a lot. It just more or less starts off into this new scene, but it says in verse 13 of chapter 2, he, that is Jesus, went out again beside the sea, that's the Sea of Galilee, and all the crowds was coming to him, and he was teaching them, which he did often. Teach them about the kingdom of God, teach them about the way of Jesus and the way of God. And he passed by, and as he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth. Now I want to stop right there. Sitting at the tax booth. Now, tax collectors, I've spoken multiple times on tax collectors, but let me just refresh your memory. They were a group of Jewish people who basically went to the Roman government, who was the occupying nation of Israel, whom Israel resented because that was somebody who was over them and oppressing them and who wasn't a godly leader and so forth. And the Jews, who were tax collectors, went to them and said, we will collect the taxes you want from the Jewish people, and then they gave them authority. So they go back and then they take more, arbitrarily more. How much more do I want to pad my pockets this month with? And so I'm going to ask for a little bit more in that regard. And so they got very wealthy because there really was no checks and balances on this. So they were hated. They would be the equivalent of a Jew selling out a fellow Jewish countryman to Nazis back World War II time. Now, the only people you hate more, if you're a Jew back in the 40s and 30s, you hate more than the Germans, is the people selling you out to the Germans, right? It's your own countrymen who sell you. That's the people the Jews were hated people. So here's a corrupt guy in the middle of doing his evil craft of swindling people right in the middle of the act. And Jesus comes by that tax booth and he said to him, "Follow me." Now that seems a little bit scandalous right there, but the response is pretty amazing. And he gets up right away and he follows him, leaves his tax booth. Now, then verse 15, it assumes there's a lapse of time, and Jesus actually went to Levi's house and started eating a meal with him. And it says, as he reclined at table in his house, many tax collectors and sinners, and sinners is those people who live in complete violation of God's law. Prostitutes might be an example of that. Were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many tax collectors and sinners who followed him. Now that is a very uncomfortable statement, isn't it? That there are many tax collectors, the lowest, and sinners, and you can fill in the gaps of those, but anybody who is just choosing a lifestyle outside the commands of God for their profession or way of life. Sitting at this table with Jesus, and he's eating with them. Now, the reason I think this is uncomfortable is because not only eating, but it says many were following him. What is allowed to follow Jesus? Like, what do you have to do to follow Jesus? Who do you have to be to follow Jesus? We have a whole list of things that we think ought to be checked off, right? Now, this is not saying that they were trusting him for the salvation, but it begs the question, what kind of fellowship did he enjoy even with them there? I mean, it kind of leaves that to be answered, a bit nebulous there. And at the very least, I think this acknowledges that Jesus allowed people to be in process. He allowed people to be in process. He didn't cut them off because they didn't meet all the moral codes. He allowed them to be in process. You want to be near me? Fine. I want to be near you. You want to be around me? I want to be around you. I'll be around you. Why? Because you're valuable. And he was communicating to them their value. So, this helps us answer some questions. Let me just throw out some right now before we move forward. But some of the questions of, like, can I go to a wedding of a gay couple? I think Jesus would say, yeah, you can go. Yeah, you can go. Can I make a cake for a gay wedding? Yeah, I think you can. I think you can. The permission's there. Now, the flip side of these two conversations is those of you who feel, yes, I can, don't turn around and start judging those who say, well, no, I don't think I can. Right? That's not the flip answer to this. It's not saying, well, because you can, then the law says you have to. It's saying there's a permission that Jesus gives for you to look at this saying, you know what? How am I going to engage them in the love of Jesus? And there's permission there. So, they followed him. And the scribes and the Pharisees, when they saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, said to his disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Now, I find it interesting, he doesn't go to Jesus, but his disciples. I think probably because what we do is we find people most like us to talk about the person least like us. It's called triangulation, right? You go to someone who feels like it's in your inner circle to complain and talk and ask questions about somebody who doesn't feel in your inner circle. This is a problem outside the church, inside the church, everywhere. But they do the same thing here. They go to disciples. Why is he eating with these people? You should go to Jesus and ask that, but they don't. Now, the meal was scandalous. The meal was such an important portion and part of Jewish life, especially for these Pharisees. Let me explain why. The meal was a picture. Everyday meals were a picture. Because in the scriptures, they see that the end of the age would be pictured by a meal where God is sitting there with all of the holy ones surrounding him. And so every time you sat down at a meal, you were kind of picturing the hope in this future restoration when evil is gone and God is victorious and your oppressors are out of the way. So meals had a great significance. But more than that even is in the Old Testament, priests themselves had a way in which they prepared for the meal. They had to do a lot of cleansing, wash their clothes, wash their body, prepare for this kind of a meal. And so they decided, hey, we're all priests before God. We should our meals are holy, sanctified times. And then, to throw onto that, 229 of the rabbinic traditions, and there's 341 of them, 229, 341, we're talking about and forbidding table fellowship with sinners. That's the majority of the rabbinic conversations in Penn is about this meal because of how highly valued it was. And here, because it's picturing the end times, because you're a priest, because it's such a volatile thing, can you then have a meal with sinners? People who haven't yet changed. See, this is a scandal. This is I can't overestimate the importance of this meal to the Pharisees. In fact, rabbinic teaching, if a tax collector even entered your home, the entire facility was unclean, and you had to leave and do some kind of ceremony to make it clean again. That was just the process, and how much they reviled tax collectors. There is no modern equivalent for how scandalous this would be. Let me give you a picture. Imagine after 9/11, you see a picture of Jesus sitting down with a group of the Taliban having a meal and actually laughing at it. Or imagine getting a picture of Jesus out and he's with the porn producers and they're laughing together at the home and other porn stars are there and they're laughing. That would feel, you would think, write it up, man, what is Jesus doing? Is he condoning what's going on here? That's the image here. That's the picture taking place here. And Jesus knew it as he went about it. And so it says, and when Jesus heard that they were grumbling about him, basically, he said to them, that is the Pharisees, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. The implication there is, really, if you think that you're righteous, then you're never going to be a part of my fellowship. It's those who realize their need that will surround themselves to me. See, Jesus, let me put this, Jesus knew the heart that gave all the commandments their meaning. Jesus understood the heart that gave all the other commandments their meaning. Other 613 meaning because of this one, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. He didn't demonize tax collectors. He didn't throw generalized verbal grenades. He understood that kindness leads to repentance. That's the natural process of it. Kindness leads, and we think we need to let people know that we disagree with them before we can love them. And Jesus never did this except for the Pharisees. It's the only group of people that he let them know that he disagreed with up front. Everybody else, he offered, we might say, grace first, then truth. And there's just day-to-day relationships with him. It was grace and truth, but I would say it's grace and then truth. Here's how I'd put it, and you might write this down. It's actually a title, Jesus-fronted love. Instead of separation and condemnation, he advocates association and compassion. So to love your neighbor as yourself implies you lead with compassion. Now, let me give you a scenario that seems a little scandalous at times, but let me just throw this out here. Again, this is the throwing of cold water on us to kind of just make us think about our categories and what Jesus would do in his way. Imagine you were going to have lunch with Caitlyn Jenner. You were going to meet at this restaurant, have lunch with her right now. We all, depending where you land, like you might say, well, I don't agree with this whole transgender kind of thing. And so when you go there, here's the question you got to ask yourself, what do I want to accomplish, and how are you going to accomplish that? And if you say to yourself, I want this person to experience and know the gospel in Jesus Christ, then it's probably best that you don't start by offending them. It's probably best that you just go in there and say, and not say, so Bruce, good to see you. If she comes dressed as Caitlyn, why would you say, hi, Bruce? I know that we want to fight against that, but you've already created an offense there. Now you're thinking to yourself, well, if I call them Caitlyn, I'm condoning it. No, what? Well, no, you're not. You're just giving them the compassion in the situation. Because Proverbs chapter 18, verse 19 says, a brother offended is more unyielding than a fortified city. You start off with an offense, I'm just going to stand my ground and fight this topic, right away, an offended brother is more unyielding than a fortified city. Now, we put a lot of construction into fortification of cities because we know how important the defense is, right? We lead with love. We lead with compassion. Do you really want to start off with an offense? Start with compassion for this person, compassion for them. Do they know that you love them? Can you at least find some grounds of agreement and saying, hey, we're two people. There are some differences, but there's a lot of similarities. We all understand that like if you're married, right, you sandwich your conversation, right? Your spouse doesn't tell you that. Let me tell you about how to sandwich a conversation. You start with a compliment. You then address the issue, you end with a compliment. You lead with compassion, lead with love, right, is the key there. And in every relationship, sometimes if you lead with truth even, there's a whole relationship established there to give context to that, hopefully. I don't really know if Jesus preached the gospel in that setting that night. I don't know what he said. It doesn't say what he said there. Maybe he did. I mean, Jesus is a good preacher. I'm sure he got it some way. But all I'm saying is it doesn't mention that. The point here is to show that his heart was willing to engage people who were very much unlike him. In the contrast of that, of the Pharisees who said, you're unlike us, then we will not associate with you. In fact, we will let you know through boundaries and created that how much different and far apart we are, not only from us, but how much you are reviled in God's sight because we're so good. We sometimes feel like when we offer someone compassion, let's say you got that Caitlyn Jenner example, that we are condoning sin. We can feel like people are condoning, and that others around us will look at us having a meal with them and actually laughing and sharing a moment as you're condoning what they're doing, and that's not the case. See, I think this is where the Jesus story is so valuable, because I don't think Jesus' highest value was to be seen as not condoning sin. I don't think Jesus' highest value was to be seen as not condoning sin. You can write that down, go back and listen to the thing. But I don't think that's because if it was, he was clearly being viewed as condoning sin. Why is your teacher eating with these people? And it didn't seem to bother Jesus that they were talking that way or that he was in that environment. And he knew people were thinking he was condoning it, but that wasn't his concern. His concern was to communicate the heart of God for people and let them show and experience that. He reached out to people that were scandalous, meeting with noted sinners in public. He had table fellowship with them and wasn't afraid of condoning, that might look like condoning sin. I can enjoy you, and doesn't mean I'm actually condoning what you're doing. We're just engaging and enjoying each other. I'm leading with compassion. I'm leading with relationship. I'm leading with love. We think it's a lot of fear attached to this, but he genuinely enjoyed people, and I think he genuinely enjoyed these guys and these people he was having fellowship with there that day. I think our greatest fear is that we'd be perceived as condoning sin. I think that's our greatest fear. And I want to give you permission to set that aside. I want to give you permission to say, if somebody thinks that of you, that's not on you. Okay? Because it happened to Jesus here. They thought and Jesus like, that you can, but I know what I'm doing here. I came to seek and save the lost. And where does a physician go? He goes to them. He walks into their home. Right? And since we are about communicating a relational message, restoring relationship, it has a relational component, not a standoffish, shame on you, do this, but more of there's a relational component to the messengers who bear the message. A Bible professor, when he was first at the school, and he does it to this day, but someone that I think is just, I really appreciate him and the way he just processes things, but one of the assignments he gave to his class in Calm Theory was to read the entire Quran, cover to cover. He said, you do this, you're a part of the 1% of the world that's actually done it, but to read the whole Quran cover to cover. Now, he would get most every semester, parents calling in and saying, I didn't send my kid to Christian university to read the Quran. You would say, well, what'd you send him here for then? Well, I sent them here, sent them to become a follower of Jesus. And he would say, do you know that 1 out of every 5 people in the world are Muslim, identify as Muslim? And we're called to bring the gospel and Jesus' love to them. And how in the world are we going to actually do that if we know nothing about them? See, you can't have compassion for somebody you don't know anything about, because all it is generalizations and categories and demonizations that you've heard from the outside, but until you really know them, you can't have compassion on them. At least we're moving a step toward them. Now, he would get other questions. Well, what happens if a student, well, let me go to this other one first. What he would do with that assignment is he would have them read it and then write down 10 points of agreement they had between Christianity and the Quran, or the Bible and the Quran. Now, there's 50 points of agreement. That's for 10. And students were okay with critiquing and tearing apart, as we are with tearing apart people's arguments, but not with actually finding some common ground to springboard from, which is also indicative of us as well. I'll tear your argument apart, but let's find some common ground, and then we can build on that and show you who Jesus really is. That's what Jesus, I think, is doing in this situation. He's establishing, guys, you are valuable. And you're worth the time to sit here with, because once you realize that I've listened to you, there's a platform for conversation about what really matters. Another, well, we'll move on from there, but I thought that was a fascinating assignment. See, Jesus was so compelling to people far from God because he fronted love. So if there's anything we can do to advance the agenda of Jesus, I believe it starts here with us actually listening, us actually caring, not just caring that they hear the gospel, caring about them, because people know what your agenda is for them. And if it isn't to really, if they're like, hey, I just want you to know this, if I'm not, I'm gone, but no, I love you, well, gosh, is that not the embodiment of the faithful love of God for us? Now, I want you to think about this. Let's break down the categories of us and them and start moving toward people a bit more like, hey, sinner, 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 all right? Let's engage sinner, sinner. Now, to do that, we've got to start taking seriously a teaching of Jesus that I think the church historically, and really just people in general historically, get wrong all the time. And it's one we quoted off a lot, but it's one that we get wrong because it's the way we're wired. Our sinful nature takes things that we grew up with. We grew up a certain way, and we get knee-jerk reactions. We get muscle memory toward those, and so our immediate response is to judge those who aren't like us. That's our knee-jerk reaction when something is unlike us. If you're a fitness guru, you see somebody who isn't and is perhaps let it go on too long, your first inclination probably toward that is how could they? Shame on them for letting themselves get so out of shape, right? If you hold up a high value on just productivity and success, and somebody's a bit more laissez-faire and nonchalant, you kind of first thought is, well, productivity is the source of godliness. What are you doing, right? So we have this knee-jerk reaction, but Jesus speaks into that in Matthew 7. He says, why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Now here he's assuming that we all have a log in our eye, and the assumption is that what's in your eye is bigger than what's in the person's eye next to you, that you're looking at and trying to assess the value and the posture of that relationship. Or how can you say to your brother, and this is not just a Christian, this is just a person, this is a person you disagree with, we might say, on an issue even, let me take the speck out of your eye, because clearly you're in the dark and it's blinding you, when there is a log in your eye. You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the log or the speck out of your brother's eye. Guys, is Jesus opposed to sin? Yes, absolutely. But let me tell you whose sin he's most opposed to. Mine. Of everybody in this room, as I stand here, the sin he's most opposed to is mine. And when you ask that question, whose sin he's most opposed to, it finger points to you. That's what this text is going at. You're so busy trying to micromanage all the nuances of their world, right? But you've got to realize you've got a bigger sin problem than they do, at least from your vantage point. There's a story of Jesus having a woman who was caught in the act of adultery. It wasn't that they heard about this. She was caught in the act of adultery, brought to Jesus. I don't know where the guy was, but here she was, and clearly it was a ploy to get Jesus to blink on something. And the first thing Jesus does, what does he do? Starts pointing out their sins. Now, by him doing that, was he condoning what she did? No. By him eating with these people at this feast of Levi's, was he condoning, that you shouldn't be a prostitute or shouldn't be a no, he's not condoning anything. Right? But he points out the sin of these people who brought her to her first before he deals with her. If we deeply understood our sin nature, we'd consider other sin as a speck of dust compared to our sin. So the posture that we have toward the world is to assume that we are the worst of sinners. Now that's hard because we get to a point where we think we're pretty good people. I got a whole list of why I'm a good person. And that is a compassion killer. Now, I'm not saying live it, oh man, I'm terrible. What I'm saying is just the awareness of the amazing mercy required to maintain the relationship that you have with God. Always being aware and conscious of that as you interact with somebody, saying, what is required for relationship with this person? Start realizing the amazing mercy God requires to have relationship with you, and then offer a small portion of that to this person. That's what we're called to do. And I don't hear that. I'm not saying it's not said, but I think the most dominant kind of comments we say are, well, I know I'm a sinner. Yeah, sure, I'm a sinner. But I don't ask the church to accept my sin. Well, okay. But you do ask the church to accept you as a sinner, right? And you do ask the church to accept that you're in process. And accept that you don't have it all figured out from the beginning of stages, and that all I'm saying is that we ought to give people the same kind of grace. Right? If you're not blind anymore, but now you see, why would you start beating up people who are blind and saying, oh, can't come to Jesus right now and hear him talk. You're too blind. You're walking in the bad stuff, right? Oh, no. Another one I hear is, we need to talk. We need to speak about truth, Tim. When does truth come to all this? And I say, we want to speak truth. But why do we feel the need to have to rush past grace just to get to truth? And say, if I'm going to err on one side, it's truth and not grace. And I think Jesus is saying, no. If you're going to err, Paul's saying, he doesn't talk about what you preach. He talks about how you show what you show, right? You speak the truth in love. If there's no love, then hold back the truth. If there's no love, it's not the Jesus way to speak truth out of anger and frustration there. Now, Jesus spoke frustration. Do you know who he spoke out of frustration to? Pharisees. Those are the people he spoke frustration to. The people who were saying to the world, we know God better than you. Did Jesus preach a gospel message there at the meal? I don't know. Maybe he did. I can't imagine Jesus not promoting himself, right? In some ways going, oh man, I love you, right? And I would love you to follow me, right? I can't imagine that, but it doesn't tell us, because the point is not so much to say to you, what do you do at a meal, but what posture do you have toward these people? And what's the heartbeat driving it? I mean, is our heartbeat really, I want to see people saved? Or is it, I want to win this argument? I want to see that person go from being eco-friendly to eco-mean. Or switch that around, right? From being green to being, we'll say, black. I don't know. Pick the opposite of green. I don't know what that is. Or being from the right side of the political party to the left side. If that's your goal, then your ambitions are far too small, and you are caught up in what I would say, Paul says, don't get caught up in the trivial things that to Timothy, what is it called? You're a soldier, don't get caught up in civilian affairs. We get caught up in civilian affairs trying to argue topics and not realizing this is the heart that we're after. It's the heart that Jesus is after. So, I find it fascinating, this whole scene that Jesus did. I just do. And guys, I want you to know that I have a knee-jerk reaction to a lot of things that I don't think Jesus would. In fact, I look in this section here and I think, what was the disciples' experience like at that meal? Peter, James, John, good Jewish boys who had a similar worldview and understanding as the Pharisees. No doubt that's why they went to them. What was his view, their view on that? I don't know. I know that Peter struggled with his table fellowship because later on, he had a hard time going to Cornelius' house. And later on after that, Paul rebuked him for the fact that he was segregating himself from certain people in the church of Galatia. I know that Peter didn't always get it, but this had to be an uncomfortable situation for them. I get the sense that Peter was a bit uncomfortable, and Jesus didn't say, well, Peter doesn't really matter then. He brought him through the school of uncomfortability because he needed him to have a heart that breaks for people. And here's another fascinating thing, that it's a meal. This morning we're going to share a meal together. And this is a room full of sinners saved by grace, and some just sinners. But we all categorize ourselves as sinners. And we're going to sit around, we say, a table together. Because at Jesus' last meal, he had a mixed band of people. One of the guys would betray him, clear sinner, who ate his meal, shared it with them. You had a zealot, a guy who was, when you asked the question, what do we do about Rome? Simon the Zealot would have said, we gotta fight them, take them to war. Whereas Matthew or Levi here, who's a disciple of his, would have said, no, we join arms with them. We find common ground. Both were sitting at Jesus' table enjoying fellowship with Jesus. And there's even someone Jesus called the devil there. What I just am trying to communicate to you is that we want to have a posture toward people of compassion. A posture, and let that then drive the conversation. A posture of listening, a posture of caring. I think that's so key, because that is the better way. Lord, change my heart. Not so I see them as so different than me, but that I see them so similar that I can come and we can share and they can experience the light of Jesus Christ. That's the better way. Change me. Have the ushers come forward and pass out the communion elements. And once they do, I'll walk you through taking them.